I pay homage to the Buddha. I pay homage to the Dhamma. I pay homage to the Sangha. When I was in my late teens or early 20s, I don't really remember when it was, I took a university course on North American history. And I had a really amazing professor. I wish I remembered her name. But there was this one point in our course where she shared with us an article that an anthropologist had written sometime in the 1950s called the Body Rituals of the Nakarima. And she told us that, well, the name has actually been changed. What I want you to do is I want you to read this article and see if you can figure out which North American people they're talking about in this article. And, we broke up into groups in the class, and we all have the same article in front of us, and we're going through, and we're trying to determine, okay, so it says this people are south of this particular tribe, and north of this particular tribe, and then there's these people and those people next to them. Okay, like what kind of things do they do in these body rituals? Oh, how weird. They get these sharp objects and like lacerate their faces to remove body hair. Okay, that sounds kind of weird. And we're reading the article on what they do when they're feeling ill, and they're going to the shaman who's peering over various bowls of the urine and blood to try to figure things out. And it's like, oh, it's so weird, this group of people. All the classmates were saying. And I remember sitting in the class reading the descriptions and going, hold on, this seems kind of strange. So there's this shaman that looks at the person of this tribe, and then after making a determination of what kind of special potions and elixirs they make, they jot down on a piece of paper in a special language only the shaman and the herbalist understand, and then the herbalist procures all the right stuff and then gives it to the person. And I'm like, wait, that sounds like a doctor and a pharmacist, and for sure they write in only a language those two people understand. I've never gotten a doctor's, note from a doctor to give to the pharmacist that made any sense. And so I'm looking over everything else, and I'm looking over the other examples like lacerating the face, and I'm realizing that's talking about shaving, and it's talking about the boar bristle thing they put in their mouth that goes over their teeth and everything. Like, that's a toothbrush. And then the final nail in the coffin is that I'm looking at the title of this thing, and who's this tribe? And I start taking the letters, and I put it backwards, and I realize it just says American. And so I realized that this weird tribe that we were meant to figure out in the group was us, Americans, certainly the American people of the 1950s. And so once I put it all together, I almost shout out to the class, oh, I got it, and the teacher says, no, quiet, because it was too soon, and everyone else was still trying to figure it out. And then she said, all right, come outside. And she took me outside of the classroom. She goes, okay, what did you figure out? And I told her everything. She goes, damn it, you got it so fast. No one's gotten it that fast before, right? And I felt really, really good about it. I'm like, all right, I'm smart and everything. And I got back in, and everyone else was still figuring it out for like a good half hour. It took a while. And then finally, oh, you can see the light bulbs going off in the class as they realized that what this anthropologist had done was something really sneaky. This was a real article written, I want to say 56. I'd have to look it up again to be certain. But this was an article in an anthropological journal, and it was meant to be a satirical take on the way anthropologists wrote about other cultures, in which they very much othered them, made them seem very exotic, very different, very foreign, and often wrote of the things they did, which was everyday life, as if it was very creepy and gross and all kinds of things like that. And I bring this up not to say that I was crazy smart or anything, but I will say though that I think that one of the things that helped make it clear to me, perhaps more than the other people in my classroom, was that as a person in the world, ever since I was little, I think I've always kind of felt a bit like an outsider in American culture anyway. For starters, I was a mixed kid of, European and Colombian descent, growing up in Los Angeles, being into the kind of stuff I was into from such a young age. I was always kind of set apart. And when I was observing the world, I did tend to view it from an outsider's perspective, because people seem to live a certain way and hold certain things in importance and value, and I just didn't seem to hold those same things in value. So as a kid growing up in life, I just tended to look around and, much like an anthropologist, try to figure out why people viewed the world the way they did, because it just didn't make any sense to me. And that continued well into my teens or 20s whenever I was in this class. And so when we were reading this outsider account of what it meant to be an American and the body rituals of the American, I was able to pretty quickly figure out, like, oh, well, we're just talking about Americans. Like, we go to the bathroom, we close the door to brush our teeth and things like that, but it was written in such a way that it felt exotic and different. But it always felt a little different to me. I'm not quite sure why. But I think that for me, as a Buddhist, that perspective has been helpful, because that's often the account that we get, which is to see the world from an outsider's perspective. In other words, to have an objective look at the things that people subjectively take to be a source of happiness, a source of safety, the various things that we should do in life. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately. This example I had from this college class, and the way I've always sort of viewed the world, and the way that's either helped or hindered me at different times in my life, but also the way it's helped me as a Buddhist. Because it seems that currently there are a lot of people that are just beginning to realize just how weird this world is that we live in, but particularly what's going on in America. Recent things that have been happening lately, many of my friends have been very dismayed about, heartbroken about, and shocked that events could go the way that they've gone. My wife being one of those people who I've had to console over these last few days, because it does seem that to many people the world just doesn't make sense. And I'll tell you that when I'm comforting someone, I do the job of comforting them. I don't come out right away with, like, well, the world never made sense when I was a kid, but to take a much larger perspective, there is that I have seen, that the world never really made any sense to me. And so I'm not surprised when it continues to not make sense. But the question comes into mind, when we realize that the world doesn't make any sense, and there doesn't really seem to be any sense of justice or fairness, and we're just all around confused and dismayed and disheartened, what do we do? Recently, I've been reading a very interesting story of a man that found I wouldn't say solution, but certainly a thing that he tried to do. This man's name is Christopher Thomas Knight, and some of you may know who he is. I would assume probably most don't. But as a young man, Christopher Knight, when he was about 20 years old, this would have been 1986, decided to go on a road trip. He had just graduated from his technical training. He was working and everything, and he decided to treat himself to a road trip. And he went down to the south. He was from Maine. He went down to the south, had his nice road trip, and then started to drive back up to Maine. And what he was supposed to have done is he was supposed to have driven back to his parents' house in Maine, gone back to his job, gone back to his life, and do the things that everyone does, the majority of people do, to just live his life. But what Christopher decided to do is, as he was driving back into Maine, he drove into the wilderness until he ran out of gas, took what belongings he had in his car, and went into the forest, went into the wilderness of Maine, where he then remained for 27 years. And during that time in the forest, he didn't speak to anyone, he very rarely saw anyone, and he lived in isolation except to go into various towns and camps nearby to steal. He ended up being a prolific burglar. In fact, if you type Christopher Knight's name into Google, when it says, when it lists the occupation of this person, it says American burglar. That's how prolific he was in terms of getting into these places and stealing the goods he needed. And it's quite a fascinating story because this was a guy that had his own moral code. You'd think, okay, here's this guy being a thief. How moral could he be? Well, okay, fair enough. But what this guy did is he would go and he would find cabins that were not occupied, and he would find a way of entering without breaking anything. So people would come back from wherever they usually lived to go to their vacation home, and what they would find is that all the locks were still locked, all the doors were still closed, all the bolts were still bolted, but then they would go to get the remote for their TV and realize the batteries were missing. They'd go into the freezer and see that a steak was gone. Little things like that. And he managed to do that over 27 years without being caught. Some people did see him every once in a while. There's one account of some people hiking on a very popular trail in Maine, and they came across this guy who was on the trail, and all he said was, "Hi," and he went back into the woods. And that was literally the only word he had uttered that entire 27 years he was in the woods. But eventually this guy got caught. 27 years later, this would have been 2013, he ends up breaking into a place, and it now has modern surveillance, modern alarms and everything, and people get notified and he gets caught. And he immediately surrenders. And he starts telling his story with this voice that you wouldn't believe because he hadn't spoken in so long. So he's struggling to find words and concepts and getting exhausted, but he tells his story. And this was a man who was tired of living the way people were living at the age of 20 and tried to find some kind of solution. Now the solution wasn't much of one. He ended up living his 27 years out in the wilderness as a thief. People were scared of him. People were losing their minds. People would come home and realize that a mattress had been stolen or various other things, heirlooms of theirs, because they had like a watch and the watch would be gone. And these were all things that he felt he needed to survive, and he did, because this was a man that only had a tent, went out into the Maine wilderness where the winters can get below zero, and managed to survive in his tent. Right? This was not a guy living a life of luxury with what he stole. But he did it because he wanted to be away. He wanted to be out of the system entirely. He wanted to live in seclusion. I can't help but think what this guy's life would have been like, how different it might have been, had perhaps he had known of other alternatives. Perhaps this is me being a bit too starry-eyed and optimistic, but I have to wonder, well, what if this guy had been introduced to Buddhism at a young age? Might he found a way to find seclusion in a different way? His story, at least the beginning part, before when he goes off into the wilderness, reminds me a lot of the Buddha's own story. We have a version of the story that we're often told. It's as children who are born Buddhists hear this story of the Buddha as a prince, and the prince finds various signs that he should go off into the wilderness. He sees the old person, he sees the sick person, he sees the dead person, he sees a mendicant wandering around. And that story does exist in the canon, although when we look at it, it's actually assigned to a different Buddha, a previous Buddha. And the suttas itself, what the Buddha tells of his own story, in his own words, is that he was a young man, not much older than this 20-year-old Christopher Knight. And he looked at the world and he was dismayed. He saw a world that didn't make any sense. He saw a world that was very confusing. He saw a world that didn't seem to look out or take care of anyone. And he saw a world in competition. The Buddha ends up saying that he surveyed the world and didn't see anything that hadn't been laid claim to. In other words, he sought people fighting over things, being cruel, being mean, doing various unskillful things, all in the pursuit of happiness and not getting it. And so the Buddha, much like this young Christopher, ended up going off into the wilderness. Of course, it was a time and in a culture where that looked very different. He had the option of being a mendicant. He had the option to be an alms goer and go around and take alms. So the Buddha, as the young Siddhartha, was not going around being a thief, but he was trying to find some kind of seclusion. And the Buddha, as Siddhartha before he became the Buddha, eventually realized that the kind of seclusion he was looking for was very different. It wasn't just the seclusion of being off in the wilderness away from people. Oftentimes he found that it was really helpful to be near people. He learned to be the kind of mendicant that was nearby, near the villages, where he could be around people who could offer him support in his journey and his search for a true and lasting happiness. A place where he can go and receive food, receive medicine, receive clothing, and not have to take it, not have to steal it, but it being offered as a gift. And then he was able to find a kind of practice that gave him a mental kind of seclusion. The very activity of meditation gave him something that he could rely on, a kind of nourishment that he could have out in the woods, so that he wouldn't go crazy. Christopher, on the other hand, tried to find seclusion the hard way. He just had the clothes that he had his tent, he was out in the woods, and he ended up having to steal the things he needed. Steal the food, steal the medicine, steal the clothing. And he had to do some really, really crazy things to survive the cold. According to him, on those very, very cold winter nights in Maine, what he would do to stay alive is that he would wake himself up in the middle of the night at its coldest, and he would pace around his camp until his body would get warm enough. And then he'd go back into his tent and try to sleep. And every time he got too cold again, he would get up and march around. But he had no activity that he could do to help find any kind of mental peace and seclusion. So it was just still his mind doing things. The way he describes it is that as he was out there long enough, he began to start seeing things and hearing things. One example is that there was a kind of voice and a shadowy figure that would sort of be in the periphery of his vision every once in a while. And it would tell him very strange things. Tell him to either leave the forest or go deeper into the forest, to let himself freeze, to stop trying to survive and whatnot, or go off and just to give up on what he was doing. He had no form of mental seclusion that he could rely on. And so in thinking on what's going on right now, when I think about the people right now who are really hurting and really scared, in the last few days I've come across many friends, loved ones, crying very bitter tears. I do my best to comfort them, to say sweet words, to give them strength, to in some way inspire them. My advice for people who are not on the path is different for those that are. For those of us who are cultivating the Buddhist path, I would say that if the world doesn't make sense, good, you're recognizing a painful truth. But we're not left with just that truth. We're not just left with a world that doesn't make sense. And we're not left with just the cruelty we see in those that are giving into their greed, giving into their hatred, and giving into their delusion. We have ways of taking care of ourselves in the Eightfold Path, way of developing a different way of being, in a way that secludes the mind. So I would say, for those of us who are hurting right now, going through a tough time, remember the Buddha's lesson that he learned the hard way by going off and being a renunciant and trying to cut himself off from the world. He realized that it didn't work, that he still needed to be part of the world. And so that's what we realize too, as we practice this life, developing this Eightfold Path, is that even if we are practicing seclusion, ultimately it's the seclusion of the mind. One of the examples I really like from the Pali Canon that demonstrates that is that when the Buddha talks about meditation, he talks about it as seclusion. And when stories are said of him, they refer to meditation as seclusion as well. One of the examples I came across recently that I really like it takes place when the Buddha is a lot older. He's now an old man. His body hurts. It doesn't do what it used to do. Sitting in prolonged meditation, the mind might be free, but the body sure isn't. And this particular sutta talks about how the Buddha came out of his seclusion, which means he came out of his meditation, and sat in the warm afternoon sun to warm his aching body. So even in that story, we see that the Buddha, even though his mind was free, he was a liberated being, his body was still subject to various discomforts. And that he knew the remedy. In this case, it was easing his aching body by sitting in the sun. But we also see that seclusion, as we practice it, is not the goal, but it is something that we can develop reliably. So I would say that in times of deep distress, when we're really hurting, we can develop our meditation in such a way that we have a pleasant abiding. And it's important to realize that doing that is not running away. Because I think that's one of the things that we fear in today's society. We're so plugged in all the time into what's going on. All 24/7, many of us, not all of us, but many people in the world are always plugged in. They're watching the news, they're paying attention to what's happening on social media, they're on Instagram, they're on TikTok, they're on whatever. And they tell themselves that, well, I need to be informed if I want to make a difference in the world. I need to know what's going on all the time, because being informed means that I'm fighting the good fight. And what I've noticed amongst the people who are constantly trying to be informed is they're just tiring themselves out, hurting themselves, and just falling into deeper despair. And I can't help but think, oh, how good it would be if they just took some time away from all of that and had a moment of seclusion to come to this practice and develop some equanimity, to develop qualities that allow the mind to settle and be with one thing that is not all the other things we're worried about. To set aside greed and distress with reference to the world and just do one simple activity, such as following the breath, as a kind of nourishment, as a kind of food, as a way of sustaining ourselves so that when we do, once again, pick up those burdens, we can do so in a different way. We might find that we are more compassionate, more kind, more patient, and I would say also more hopeful. Because it's not that we see the world as it is and then give up on it. We see the world as it is and realize that we do what we can to help, but we have to make sure that in the process of helping others, we are helping ourselves. And so seclusion often means that. There are many people that think seclusion means running away. Seclusion means resting. Seclusion means recharging. Seclusion means finding the kind of ease that lets you go forward, putting one foot in front of the other again. So as I've been thinking of the people in my life and what they're going through, this is the advice I have to offer, which is understand when it's worth going away for a bit. But because what we're after is mental seclusion, it means it's something we can do a little bit every day. And we don't have to be like Christopher Knight and decide we're going to do so for 27 years. So as we go forward into the next months, next years, where we don't know what's going to happen, we don't know what good or bad outcomes there might be, make sure that you're continuing to set aside time for yourself, that meditation is restorative, that when we talk about it as seclusion, we're talking about it as a kind of safety. You are protecting your mind and your heart, because we have a long road ahead, many of us. And so we do need that kind of safety that we can rely on. So that's what I've got today. I hope that's helpful in some way to you. Thank you.